Hey, it's Dave. Welcome back to my channel. So today I'm going to do a video on demystifying Marshall amplifiers. And those who have come to my channel before know that I've done this already. I had it broken up into 2 videos and corrections, and now I'm just going to do it all here. One video. One video. First off, let's give a little history. Jim Marshall started a shop in 1962. He was a drummer. In 1963, with the musicians in the area, Pete Townsend, etc., they come up with the idea of making amplifiers. He enlists the help of Ken Brand, Ken Underwood, and Dudley Craven. They all decide they kind of like the sound of the Fender Bassman, the 4x10, and that's basically what the amps are based on. And the first amp is the JTM 45. Now, in 1965, Rose Morris gets involved, and they're a distribution group. Well, Rose Morris has a catalog to order from, and in that catalog, there's catalog numbers, and that's where the model numbers come from with Marshall. You have the 1958, which is a 2x12, the 1959, which is a 100-watt super lead, the 1960A, which is the slant cab, the 1960B, which is the straight cab. You have all the model numbers are basically catalog numbers. So people get confused because they think like, oh, a 1959 is from 1959. No. So in 1967, Marshall decides they want to change the series to JMP. This is the start, I believe, of the Plexi in the 1959 because they used a plexiglass front panel as opposed to the anodized gold plate there. But also in 1965, when they signed this deal with Rose Morris, Jim Marshall was making an amplifier called Park Amplifiers because a friend of his who had a shop, he wanted to continue making it and called it Park, which I believe was his friend's wife's maiden name. But those Park amplifiers are excellent as well and very sought after. So you have models like the 1959, the 1987, which is the 50 watt. Obviously, it came out much later than the 59 because we could see where it is in the catalog. And you have, all these different combos and whatnot. Now, the thing with Marshall at this point is everything is hand-wired. This will take us all the way up to about early 74. And in 1974, they decide they're going to go with the PCB boards. And it goes to a circuit board, and it's no longer hand-wired. Around this time, he's prototyping amplifiers with a master volume. These prototypes are referred to as the Mark I. When the amplifier is released, it is released as the Mark II, and those models are the 2203 and the 2204. 2203 being the 100 watt, 2204 being a 50 watt. Now, there's a whole lot of amplifiers being released. You have the super bass, and I'll maybe scroll different model numbers so you can see what they are. But it's unimportant as to just understanding how it well worked. So in 1980, that was the end of the Rose Morris contract, and they didn't want to continue. They wanted to do it somebody else and do it on their own and figure it out and make a new distribution deal. So this is what starts with the JCM 800. Now, JCM 800 was Jim Marshall's license plate, which stood for James Charles Marshall. The JTM was James and Terry Marshall, that was his son, and JMP was Jim Marshall Products. So the JCM 800 was, he put his initials on a license plate, and I think they arbitrarily gave him the number 800. And so when the 80s rolled around, that's what he used for that series. It also signifies the end of Rose Morris. Now, in this series, we have amplifiers that already have existed, the 2203 and the 2204 master volume, except now in the 800, we have an effects loop. So if you have a 2203 that's a JMP, it will not have an effects loop unless it was added aftermarket, but it comes from the factory without one. And the JCM 800 2203 has an effects loop. At this time, he also decides he makes a 2-channel amp, and we bring in the 2205 and the 2210. The 2205 being a 50 watt, the 2210 being a 100 watt. And now these aren't catalog numbers, these are numbers they're making. Obviously with the 05 being 50 and the 10 being 100, kind of is a tip-off. In the first year of the JCM 800, he's still making a few 1959s. And those are very rare, and if you can find one, grab it. It's a 1959 JCM 800, which is a super lead. Now, the amps are kind of pretty easy at this point, because if you have a super lead or a super bass, you know you have a 1-channel amp that does not have a master volume. If you have a Mach II amplifier, you know you have a 1-channel amp with a master volume. And now we have the 2205 and the 2210, the first 2-channel. Anyway, so now we come into the 900s. We come into the 90s, and in the 90s, again, all these numbers now are going to be made up, not to do with the Rose-Morris numbering. So we have the 2100, which is basically a 100 watt head. I have one right up top here. The 2100 is basically like a 2203, except it has what's called the gain sensitivity knob, which adds like a clipping diode, but you can take it out and it's basically a 2203 or add it in. Now, this was right in 1990, and they had the dual reverb, which was the 2205 and the 2210, but adding clipping diodes into the circuit, and that's because they were trying to compete with companies like Mesa. Those models are called the 4100 and the 4500. The 4100 being the 100 watt 2-channel dual reverb, and the 4500 being the 50 watt version. So now we see a little bit of backlash from people about the 2100s having that not being all tube, which was ridiculous. Because, in my opinion, it's probably one of the best amps Marshall's made, because it is a 2203 if you just turn the gain sensitivity knob and take the diode out of the circuit. But anyways, what happens is in about 93-ish, they release the 2100 SLX and discontinue the 2100 and the 2500. Now the 2100 SLX is the same amp as the 2100, but except now they changed the tubes from EL34s to 5881s, and they add an extra 12AX7 in the gain sensitivity knob instead of the clipping diode. I don't think it's as good. Some people love it. I'm not a fan, but I think that they had it better off with the 2100. So anyway, so that's what happens there. And about 97, we break into the JCM 2000 era, and we get to the DSL 50, the DSL 100s, which are basically modified versions of the modified versions of the 4100 and the 4500, taking the clipping diode again out, more of a stripped down again, back to all tube and no diodes. And after that, I really don't, you don't really have to know much. So basically, all you really need to know is super leads, like a 1987, which is a 50 watt, or a 1959, which is the 100 watt, no master volume. The 2203 and the 2204, which are the Mark II models, will have a master volume. If it's a JCM 800, it's going to have the effects loop, and if it's a JMP, it will not. You have the JCM 900 series, which you have, again, I mentioned the 4100, the 4500, the 2100, the 2500, and the 2100 SLX. So a lot of times I'll see people posting on Craigslist, and they'll be like, I have a 74 JMP. What the hell is that? Is it a super lead? Is it a 50 watt? Is it a 100 watt? Is it a 2203? Is it a 2204? Is it a, I mean, at that point, they even made the super bass. It could be a PA. After the JCM 2000 era, we get into like the JVM, which was James and Victoria Marshall. Victoria, his daughter, who took the company over. Now, I'm not a big fan of this era. And I believe a lot of the workers that worked there, there was like a walkout at some point, and those guys went and started Black Star amplifiers, which are kind of based on like a modern Marshall. And they're manufactured in China, but they have a really nice sound and they're good. You know, it's funny, there's a guy, Roy Blankenship, who has the, he always says, you know, there hasn't really been an amp designed since 1965, you know, which is probably true. You have like, Leo Fender really designed a lot of amps. And then you have guys that came out after that basically are building off of that amp design. You know, Marshall being one of them, being off the Basement. And, you know, you have so many different amp companies. Mesa Boogie started off as a Fender mod guy. And just most of the designs are designed pre 65. I mean, even though like the high gain amps, they're still based off of these older style amplifiers. But I just wanted to do this video so people could understand about the Marshall amplifiers and understand that there's different model numbers and there's different amps. It's not just a, you know, oh, I have a JMP. Well, that doesn't mean anything. That just tells you what series you have. You know, it tells me what years you may have bought it, but it doesn't tell me what amp you have. So, this is why I wanted to do this video. And I hope it helps some, and I hope you get a little piece of information out of it. Before I go, I also want to just bring up that in 1987, they released the 25th anniversary amplifier, the Jubilee, which I believe is the 2555. And then they also released in the 30th anniversary, which was the 6100 in the JCM 900 series. And those are like off models and whatnot. But for the most part, I hope this helps you understand how the model numbers work and basically how what the amps are. And because it's really not that difficult when you come to think of it. You know, and then you have like these signature models like the Kerry King, which is like a JCM 800. So they basically modded an 800 for his spec. I think they put like a noise gate built in or whatnot, and it was called the JCM 800 KK. And then there's the JCM 800 Zach Wild, the ZW. And I'm not sure because I've never cared about any of those amps, which model they're basing it on. I would imagine that the Zach Wild one is probably a 2203. And same with the Kerry King. They all want the master volume. Anyway, I hope that answers a lot of questions for you. And if you this will help if you're especially trying to buy a used Marshall, or if you just wanted to understand the Marshall line yourself. And you can always go look them up, look up the history, and they're fun amplifiers. There's so many great amplifier companies out there now. It's such a great time to be a young musician as far as equipment goes, and it's a horrible time to be a musician as far as the music industry goes. So, can't have everything. Anyways, very good.